I'm here in the WCAT studio in Wakefield with Doug Heath and Alison Simcox, whose book was recently just released from the press. Very exciting to have that in your hands finally, after all that work.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, yeah. Doug and Alison have talked to the Historical Society and to many groups in both Saugus and Wakefield before, so many viewers will probably be familiar with them. Doug Heath was born in New Jersey and grew up in New Mexico and New York City. I hear that after serving in the Navy, you worked as a hydrogeologist.
Yes, yes.
At the U.S. Geological Survey and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency,
Yes.
both of those, okay. For, I can't believe it, 30 years.
Yes.
And you specialized in protecting drinking water for,
right, throughout New England.
as well as your work as a scientist. We also know you from another direction as a local historian, photographer, genealogist, and you use 19th century glass plate methods.
Yes. Yes.
Very, very impressed by that. And Alison, you grew up even further away. You grew up in Chelmsford, Essex, England, or you were born there, and then you grew up in Lexington, Massachusetts. So a little bit closer, inching your way to this part of the state. And in 1998, you were the second woman to earn a doctorate in engineering from Tufts. And you work in the EPA's Boston office in the air program as a specialist in fine particle and ozone pollution. Hiking, soccer, bicycling, ocean kayaking, quite a lot of impressive pastimes you have.
I like being outdoors.
Oh, okay. I do too. That's wonderful. And I do know you from the other books that you have written about local history, and I gather that one of them at least led you down the path for this current book. Can you tell me how you first got interested in local history?
We knew from doing this book, you know, how to put it together,
Right.
but we realized that there were so many other local stories to be told, and that there were some areas that, you know, had not been covered at all, satisfactory to us because of our own questions. And one was Breakheart, but also the Middlesex Fells. And Middlesex Fells, this book is on all of Middlesex Fells, and this was a really ambitious project because it's 5 square miles, one of the largest parks near an urban area in the entire world, and part of the, you know, the wonderful metropolitan park system. So this story was fascinating to us, but we thought it was actually too ambitious. But we tackled it in any case because the publisher wanted us to do the entire park. So we kind of got our feet wet, you know, on these before we moved into these last couple of books, which are it's the same publisher, but it's a publisher that was bought by Arcadia Publishing.
Oh, okay.
So this is the History Press, and in these books we actually now have more narrative and fewer photos, and so the format's somewhat different. They're both fun formats, but I really, as a writer, like to have more text and more narrative, and so I enjoy the History Press.
On all of these books, we're really fortunate to have some great sources. One of the key sources was meeting Sean Fisher, who was archivist for the Department of Conservation and Recreation, because he had an enormous collection of state-produced photographs and maps and so forth. And that came really into play with Breakheart Reservation and Middlesex Fells.
Okay.
So many of the images there are all attributed and credited to, you know, DCR. Other sources just fell into our lap as we went along the projects. We met people who had their own individual family photographs.
All right, interesting. You know, it's funny, I had assumed that because you worked in water quality that Lake Quannapowitt was an outgrowth of that.
That's
originally.
a fair assumption, actually.
Yeah.
Lake Quannapowitt was the beginning of our writing career.
And obviously, as the Saugus Historical Society is interested in local history, But very often, the people most interested are the people whose families have gone back a long way in town. And it's partly fascinating reading your biographies that neither of you grew up right in this locale.
No.
And yet, now that you've been living here for a while, or maybe even when you first moved here, you began to have some curiosity about what makes this place a little bit different than other places you may have lived. And, you know, what's special and unique and, you know, just intriguing that you both came to have such an interest in local history.
Right. Well, New England has such a long and, you know, rich history to draw upon. So many tales that have gone untold about the people who lived and worked here, as well as the Native Americans, who unfortunately have left, you know, very little records,
Right.
other than just stone implements about their ways of life.
We try to acknowledge Native Americans in all of our books. Actually, I think the Murder at Breakheart Hill Farm is the only one where we don't talk about the Native Americans, because that's not you know, relevant to the story.
The time period is so
Right.
different, right?
Yes.
So, yeah, this was quite a different book than our others, and so I think it took some of the others, though, to work us up to the point where we could try this genre, which I never thought I'd read a true crime book. It really did evolve and became of more interest the more I thought about it, and the more research that Doug collected on the murder, because he wouldn't stop researching it. And he does that. He researches and he's an excellent researcher. He's the researcher on these projects, and I'm the writer. And so at some point it becomes extremely challenging to deal with a mountain of material that, you know, you're then expected to put into a coherent form and structure that will make it a compelling book for people to read. So that was my challenge. But he made it challenging and easy at the same time because of his in-depth research, where I had an abundance of raw materials, but then, you know, you have to sort through that. So it was definitely a challenge. But it was fun too, because the story is so good.
Well, I'm an avid reader of murder mysteries, and I think that what intrigues me the most is often the personalities of the people involved. The motives certainly are the things that everybody kind of wants to know. If you have no background into the personalities, it becomes more of a statistic than anything else. And historical period mysteries, mostly I read fiction because it's so difficult to find out about the personalities of people if they're not famous.
Yes.
We got really lucky on this, and that's because of Doug's research, but you know, that we would have found this piece of it, I think, fairly early in the process, and that's that the entire transcript of the trial is publicly available.
Right.
And that's quite unusual. 800 pages of trial transcript. So another book which had that benefit was actually The Dark Tide. Dark Tide by
Stephen Palaio.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
And so when we went to a talk by him about Dark Tide, because that's a fascinating book, very quite well known, and that piece of it, when he was talking, really struck us. Like, he had the transcript. We do too, and that's, you know, we have a connection there.
Right.
So and we know what a benefit that is, because it gives you, from the people themselves involved in the story, from their own mouths, you know, the story, and they're under oath. So you can be pretty sure that you're getting the truth for most people. And so we had, you know, the actual characters speaking their own words, and so I think that enriched the book a great deal.
Right.
Yeah, a lot of the book is devoted to the trial, which occurred in March of 1901. And we found out just by chance that the key prosecutor of the trial was Hosea Knowlton, the Attorney General at the time. And he had become famous because he was the key prosecutor for Lizzie Borden case
Oh, I thought
about
it
8
sounded
years earlier, in
familiar.
1893.
That's it.
Same prosecutor.
And this was really his, I think, maybe his last major capital case. As Attorney General, he always wanted to prosecute the cases, all the murder cases, and this was no exception. And unfortunately, he died shortly afterward,
Oh.
at too young an age. But just learning about him and his life and his whole experience in prosecuting this case was really rewarding. I can also mention that it was really rewarding looking at the newspapers at the time. I probably went to the Boston Public Library in their microfilm department about 15 times. And each time I would sit there and read dates and dates and dates about this trial from the 8 major Boston dailies. In those days, newspapers were the key source of social media. There was no radio, there was no television. People got virtually all their information, be it local events or international affairs,
This is
through
1900.
their newspapers. And there were 8 dailies in Boston, all very competitive.
Oh, okay.
And in this particular case, we found out that they assigned their best writers and their best artists to cover it.
But these were not famous people before the
They
incident
weren't, but
took
it was a
place.
famous case,
When this
and it
case,
sold papers.
when this hit the press,
Yeah.
it was the biggest case, for years, and it captivated all of the North Shore of Boston and Boston itself. It absolutely dominated the 8 newspapers that existed in the Boston, and there were other papers too, as well as the Boston area papers. So it was a highlight of all the papers because it was such a violent crime.
Oh, yes, the gruesomeness.
It was
would-
gruesome.
Yeah.
And it had some interesting, and we won't give away the details, but it has some interesting personal dynamics between the characters involved.
Right.
And so people were fascinated as to what was the motive. Is the accused, is he culpable?
Yeah.
What is the evidence? How did these people live? Because they had a strange living arrangement. So it really ticked off many of those points that cause a case to rise in popularity and captivate an audience.
Yeah. But, well, it is just amazing that all those different newspapers from Boston, not just the local towns, followed it for such a long time, because
Right.
you would figure if there were other things going on in the country and in Massachusetts, and sorry to say, probably some other murders also happened during the time period, and yet this is the one that stuck in people's minds, that they
Right.
wanted to know the details and have it resolved in some way.
Well,
Right, we actually tried. We actually mentioned a few of those important international events and national events in the course of telling the tale, just to put it into context and to let people know that these other big events happened at the same
Right.
time.
Such as the death of Queen Victoria.
Death of Queen Victoria
Yeah.
is an example of, and that didn't dominate the news as much as this case.
What I found fascinating was the close cooperation of the press, the reporters, with the police.
Okay.
And a good example is that when Bailey's body was discovered, in Floating Bridge Pond in eastern Lynn, a wagon was summoned, a patrol wagon, the police wagon, to come and help out with the recovery and so forth. And riding with the police was Harlan Cummings, a young reporter from the Lynn Daily Evening Item.
Oh.
He was the first on the scene. And he, of course, had the major headline that night because they published in the evening. So that's why you have, his headline in the book as before anybody else.
Yeah, it's not
And-
giving away a lot of the story to say
Right.
that the body of George Bailey was found in a pond in
Yeah.
Lynn.
Uh-huh.
So, that was where he was.
That's how people knew for sure.
Well, they
that-
Well, they didn't know it was him at first.
Right.
right.
But they found it eventually from the clothing he was wearing. And he had also been arrested in the previous August. This occurred in October, but previous August he had been arrested by the Lynn police for selling tainted milk. So a couple of the officers knew George, and they knew what he was wearing.
Right.
And so eventually, within a very short time, they identified him and where he lived. And that's how Best, who was the accused, was arrested shortly that evening, right after the discovery of the body.
But whether he whether he did it or not is what the book's about in a sense, as well as the setting and the character development. But there were no witnesses to this crime.
Well, that's the thing that always leaves some doubt.
That's
Yes.
right. So it was all circumstantial evidence.
Right.
And at this time, nobody had ever been convicted of a capital offense where there was only circumstantial evidence. So we won't give away the verdict except to say that is key, is that it was circumstantial evidence.
Yeah.
And the fact that there were no witnesses made the crime all the more intriguing to people. So
Yeah.
Also, reporters hung around. They ran around the old farmhouse and barn. They talked to the police, who allowed them free rein to go
they
in
went
the
into
farmhouse.
the morgue.
They went into the morgue. When George was taken to the morgue, reporters were there to report on, you know, what was going on during the autopsy, how best, you know, responded to trying to identify the body and so forth. Also, when Susie Young, who was the woman on the left there,
Oh, that's right. There's a third person's picture up there.
she was a woman in the case, and she came down from Maine to help the police. And as she went out to the farmhouse after getting off the train in Lynn, reporters were right with her. And when she went to the farmhouse, going with the police to the various rooms, identifying this or that, the police were interested in was if anything was out of place. You know, they reported on all of her, you know,
Her
all the
reactions.
reaction, the fact that she wept bitterly and cried and sobbed, you know, from room to room. So all of this was published in the papers because there were reporters there at the time.
And of course, some of that was dramatized, as it is
Yeah.
today with papers.
Yes.
So
I
Yes.
suppose.
the extent to which she was, you know, crying her eyes out is a little bit questionable, but because reporters always want to draw their readers in.
Yeah.
So
That's quite a scoop for a young reporter, though, to be right
Yes,
on the
Harlan
scene.
Cummings. And he
who
went
i-
on to
who
become
is
editor
who?
later, I believe. Yes.
Who's who in the pictures up there?
well, the victim is facing it, is
On the
on the right.
Yeah.
That's George Bailey, and then John Best is in the center. He's the accused,
Okay.
and Susie Young has a relationship with George Bailey, which is quite interesting.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Also has a relationship with John Best that's quite interesting.
Uh-huh.
So
Yeah.
I'll leave it at that. But she's a central character in the story, and she is quite mysterious.
Yes, she is. One of the other things that happened during the case was that George's brothers, his three younger brothers, came down, you know, to retrieve
From Maine.
from Maine,
Oh.
to
He's
from
retrieve
Maine,
the body and
Wiscasset,
take
Maine.
it back to Wakefield, Maine, where
Right.
it's now in a cemetery there.
Uh-huh.
And in so doing, reporters jumped at the chance to interview them. And from these interviews, we now know a lot of the background of George's life.
Oh,
Yeah,
yes.
How
so,
it came to be that he had come down from Maine and, you know, settled in Lynn and then later in Saugus, and came down with Susie.
Right.
And it's quite a scandalous history, as people in the book will understand after reading it.
You make a good point. And that's the setting. The setting I found as a writer one of the most challenging parts of this book, because you know I had the story of the crime, but the characters, you know, where did they come from? Who were they before all of this happened? You know, just developing them as characters. So I really had to take information from family members, you know, various people that knew these people, and piece it back together from the beginning of their lives, and so that was very challenging. And then, where did they come from? You know, why did they move? How did they end up in the same location? How did they interact? You know, what was their relationship with one another? And to me, that was a very difficult puzzle to put together. And you know, we did the best we can with that, and we think we ultimately gave an accurate description of you know what their backgrounds are and how they came to.
And we also traveled to Wiscasset.
That's what I was going to ask you, if you had to travel to
And
Maine to do
we
research.
did.
We did. And we went to the graveyard, you know, where George and other family members are buried. We also went to Wiscasset itself, some miles to the south, where George had worked as a blacksmith and had settled with his first wife, originally.
Oh.
And also met Susie, and also his second wife, Abby Hilton.
He has a number of
Wait
wives.
a minute, how many?
He had
Yes,
two
he-
wives, two wives, and ended up with 9 children.
Two
And-
wives and then Susie.
Yes.
I see.
Who masqueraded or was presented as his wife.
Right.
when in
So
fact,
we won't say who she was, but she was.
Not married to him.
They were not married.
No.
Okay.
So one of the most interesting things to me was when we did take that trip to Wiscasset, and I didn't really expect to find anything today, 120 years later, that had direct evidence to this crime. We were surprised. We were totally surprised. We went to there's a jail where both George Bailey, the victim, and his second wife, Abby, had spent some time in a jail called the 1812, the old 1812 jail.
So
it still stands today. We didn't really know that before we went there.
And this is in Wiscasset.
It's in Wiscasset.
It's a museum
actually
now. Yeah.
it's a museum. It's actually worth a visit just to see this jail because it's an old stone jail that has very thick granite slabs. The whole thing's made of granite, and the
And
cells.
tiny little slits for windows.
The cells are almost medieval, and the women were on the top, and the men were on the bottom 2 floors. And so Abby was on the top, and George was actually at the same time as Abby in the same jail.
Oh.
They spent about a year or 9 months or a year on different floors of the jail.
Yeah.
But the fascinating thing was that when we went into the museum, into the entry area of the old jail, the man,
Yes, the curator.
the curator,
Yes.
had ledgers. He had ledgers from the people who had spent time in the jail. And so I said to Doug, well, wouldn't it be curious if the entries for Abby and George are in these ledgers? Because they weren't complete ledgers. They had only some of
pages.
Some
those.
years.
We got the entries for George and Abby.
Wow.
And there they were. And seeing them was like, my gosh, look, Doug, here she is. Here he is. And here's what they were accused of doing.
Yeah.
And here's the length of time they spent here. It's right here in the ledger.
Yeah.
So that was, to me, extremely exciting.
For an amazing 6 months, the 2 of them were actually in the same jail.
Yeah.
She on the
But
3rd floor,
separated.
George
Yeah.
down below. He had been arrested for adultery. She had been arrested for attempt to kill.
Attempt to kill him.
She attempted to kill George.
It's just they had
Well,
Not
they-
once,
yeah.
but several
yeah,
times.
they had a violent relationship.
Yeah.
Anyway, and the other thing was that down the road, in the area where George Bailey had grown up, name of the little village there?
Alna?
Alna, sorry.
Yes, yeah.
Down the road in Alna, there's a cemetery. And so we wandered around the cemetery and we thought, well, let's see who we can find. We saw a Bailey gravesite, but he wasn't there. So we thought, oh, okay, George is not here.
Yeah.
So we didn't know if we'd find him because he was a murder victim.
Right.
And so his family, who knows what a family would do with a person that was so savagely murdered. But then we found a site which was very interesting. It has George there. It has George's first wife. It has
Oh.
George's second wife. It has
Okay.
George's second wife's
Husband,
husband
yeah.
after George was
After
murdered.
Okay.
And none of those people are the main feature of that gravesite. The main feature of that gravesite with the largest stone is one of George's and
Well, it was his first son.
Abby's
Yeah.
sons.
Yeah.
Oh.
So Charles
Who
Bailey.
had died at a young age as a result of a railroad accident
Oh.
in 1911.
But usually you don't have the father and mother, being
Subordinate?
subordinate
No.
to the
you don't.
child.
Right.
So the gravesite is fascinating, and we think we know who put that together. We think it was probably George's mother. So it would be the grandmother of Charles,
Oh.
the oldest son. But that's speculation. It's just such
Right.
an odd grave site.
Uh-huh.
And George isn't actually named there. He's
Yeah.
called Father.
Right.
Oh.
And George's first wife is called,
Mother.
no, she's called Wife.
Oh.
It's
okay.
a very odd site.
Yeah.
But to us, after doing this research, we actually were able to figure, we were the only people, I think, that could stand at that gravesite and know who all these people are and what their relationships
Yeah.
are to
Right.
one another.
Yeah.
So,
One fun thing about doing the research was looking into Lynn's history. Lynn has a fascinating history as the shoe capital, but in the manufacturing, but it had gone through many changes over the years, obviously. But one thing we learned was how poor the characters in our book were. They came from very impoverished backgrounds, and it was a real struggle for them to survive. And learning about the fate of George's first wife, Mary, was really heartrending, I think.
yeah, she's
happened to her.
a very tragic
Right.
character.
But
very
not
tragic.
untypical at the time. Because of the poor living conditions, the amount of disease, and the lack of medical treatment they had to undergo.
Yeah.
Yeah, we hope we've really brought to life what Lynn was like at the end of the 19th century, beginning at the beginning of the 20th century, because Lynn was a very different place. It has a great history. Unfortunately, a lot has burned down there and has been lost, but Lynn was a fascinating place, and we tried to bring that to life, and what it was like to live there, to be a worker at one of the shoe factories, to be
Right.
an orphan,
Yes.
living in one
Yeah.
of these homes for orphans,
Yeah.
and what the sanitation conditions were like,
Yeah.
what hardship they had to endure. So that we hope we brought to life, and also Saugus.
And there are many people in Saugus and Wakefield and surrounding towns whose families lived in Lynn for a while. My maternal grandfather worked in the shoe factories in Lynn.
Oh, you did?
So I did hear a few stories, and
Yeah.
somewhere there's a picture, I think, of him. It's one of those shots where everyone's lined up at their machine and you can
Yes.
see
Yes,
them.
I love those
Yes.
pictures.
Yeah.
They're great.
Yes.
The other thing we hope we brought to life is farm life in the 19th century. What was it like to live on a farm in Saugus? And, really hope to bring that to life, because we have romanticized farm life, from our perspective. It was a slower lifestyle. It was, people lived by the seasons. But the truth is that it was a hard life, and there was a lot of work to do, and there were a lot of mouths to feed.
That's true.
And so we try to bring, and what did people do in their spare time? How did they socialize? It's an isolating experience living on a farm. So how did and the neighbors did connect quite a bit. They all knew each other, and the rumor mill was just amazing. So if you just did something wrong, it's unlikely that you would keep it a secret for very long. It would become gossip throughout the farm community. So we hope we brought some of that to life too.
Yeah. It's well, there were a lot of farms in Saugus in those days, and in fact, even the title of the book kind of points out that Breakheart was a different place then than it is now.
Yes.
Now Breakheart Reservation is what we would call it, and it was Breakheart Hill Farm at that time. I picture when you go to Breakheart now, there's people on the walking trails all the time. You're not really very isolated. The beach is full of people. I went there just a couple of weeks ago, and it was one of the most crowded places I've been since March. So kind of fascinating to think you really wouldn't be able to get away with anything and not be seen.
Right.
Even at night, probably.
Yes.
I've been on ranger-led meteor viewing walks at Breakheart after dark sometimes, and
It's a very dark place.
Well,
Yes.
Breakheart Hill
Yeah.
Farm was actually 18 acres near what is now the visitor center.
Oh,
It
okay.
was a working farm. It was actually taken over by the government and became a CCC camp.
Right.
That was in the 30s.
In the
Yes.
30s,
Right.
but
Yes.
before that, and the building still remained for quite a
Yeah.
long time, the farmhouse and the barn, but it was an 18-acre working farm. And the Breakheart Reservation, as we know it today, was that area plus hundreds of additional acreage,
Okay.
which was a privately owned hunting and fishing preserve
Yeah.
owned by businessmen out of Lynn.
Right.
And they had bought up the property from just small landowners. It was basically woodlots and farming and animal enclosures, and it was very cheap land because it wasn't good for farming. It was didn't have a lot of arable land.
Right.
Rocky,
so-
I'm sure.
Yeah, so only the area where the farm was farm, could be used as a farm.
Yeah.
And so this whole acreage was actually, George Bailey was hired to keep people out of this private acreage, which was owned by the
Okay.
Lynn businessmen.
Right.
And so that was he was really a caretaker.
So farming wasn't really his chief occupation.
He was a farmer from his youth. He knew a lot about farming, but his job, yes, he was hired as a caretaker
Yeah.
Right.
for this 600-acre property.
But,
Wow.
but he couldn't do it alone. That's why John Best came along.
Oh,
And
okay.
entered John Best.
And he
Okay.
was also grew up on a
Right.
farm in New Brunswick as a boy. I knew it very
yeah.
well.
Yeah, George actually tried to maintain the farm pretty much on his own for a while, but then he found he just couldn't, and he brought in many farm hands. So
Okay.
there are many farm hands mentioned in the book.
Before this incident, he
Yes.
tried
Right, so
people
Yes.
and they
he had
didn't
him.
last long.
They didn't. They found the experience working for George very disturbing.
Oh,
So that's it's very interesting that he could not keep farm hands.
right.
He would promise payment but renege on the payments.
He was not good at paying his bills or
Right.
paying his
Oh.
employees.
You mentioned the large number of people who are at Breakheart now. Well, the notoriety from this crime has that well beat. Because on October 22nd, 1900, this is about 5 days or so after Bailey's body was discovered, an estimated 10,000 people descended on that little farmhouse and
10,000
barn.
people.
Because of the
at the visitor
publicity.
center, basically.
Because of the publicity
Yeah.
from the newspapers.
Yeah.
And they wanted to see the
And they
site
all
for
went, they
themselves.
poke around the barn and
Yeah, they had police there trying to control the crowds.
Right.
They actually allowed people, and this is crazy because this is a crime scene.
Right.
Yeah.
So they allowed people to wander around.
Oh, so they could have
the
disturbed
property,
anything.
and they only had a few areas that they cordoned off. And but really, the difference between now and then, in terms of how police handle crime scenes,
Yeah.
is quite remarkable.
Right.
But they also didn't have many cars then, too. So people arrived on bicycles, which were rather a novelty then.
Yeah.
They walked. They
Right.
took the streetcars, or many streetcars then.
And,
They
and
came.
horse and buggies.
And
yeah.
horse and buggies were the mainstay
Yeah.
of
Right.
transportation.
There was one car that was noted in the newspaper that came up that old dirt road
Right.
Oh.
to, which we travel
Right.
over today.
Yeah.
That was probably the first car
Right.
in Saugus in 1900.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it was very,
Well,
very unusual.
Route 1 existed in 1900,
It
but
did.
it was dirt,
Yes.
and the overpasses weren't built till the 1930s.
Right.
And I think at that time it was considered a financial failure because
Totally.
it had been a toll road, but there wasn't enough
Right.
traffic on
Right.
it to make it worthwhile.
Right.
But Route 1 is fascinating because it was one of the first roads built in a linear fashion.
Yeah.
It just cut right through everything. And they didn't do roads like that before.
Right.
Before Route 1, which it was called the Newburyport Turnpike, and it was actually meant to link the markets in Boston with the markets in Newburyport.
Yes.
And it was considered a failure, as was like 128 when it was first built, was
Right.
considered a
Right.
road to nowhere. But Route 1 had the same reputation. It was a rutted dirt road, and it was kind of lonely at night. And
Yeah.
there were highway robbers back then, and it was not anything. I mean, not anything like we see it today.
Yeah.
And Western Avenue in Lynn, as shown in our cover, looked like this in 1900.
Oh, so that
Floating
that
Bridge
is the
Pond.
site where the body was found?
Yes, it's
Yes.
Western Avenue, which if
Oh.
you go there now, it's a 4-lane highway with
Right.
tons of traffic.
Yeah, this was a floating bridge And the
It was the
pond,
first in the country.
the pond was rumored to be bottomless, which might give you some indication of why a murderer might choose that place to dispose of a body, because
They thought it would
they
never
thought it
be
had
found.
no bottom. Right. So
Right. I see this little, is that a newspaper article? It says Bailey's head found
That's a
in
headline.
pond?
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's,
Is that the first thing they found, or the last thing they found, or?
it was close to the first thing
yeah.
they found.
It was the next day.
It was the next day, but
It
it
took
is-
2
it is-
days
it-
to find
it
rest of Bailey.
is a grisly tale, and I have to say that, you know, we didn't put all the grisly detail in there because it is such a grisly tale.
Yeah.
But the you have to tell the grisly part as well as the surrounding context of the tale to really bring home, you know, what it was that occurred.
And we
Right.
let the newspapers do that
Yeah.
because they were very descriptive.
So we quote, we
Yeah.
quote from the newspapers of the time and from the actual autopsy report.
Yeah. So the cows walking across the bridge, I assume, are not cows from Breakheart Hill Farm. Did they raise cattle,
this
or
is
what
6
did
miles
they have?
away.
This is your normal traffic across this bridge.
Oh.
This is, there's lots of farm communities. Lynn was, you know, it was an industrial center, but not in the sense that we know an industrial center today. It had a it had an industrial center, but then very quickly you'd go into farmland.
Yeah.
Very quickly, and people were always bringing produce
Right.
from, you know, one
And these
market to another, to one farm to another, and they would walk across this bridge, and you know, a lot of the traffic was animals.
And,
Yeah.
and Western Avenue is the main link between Lynn and Salem. It's
So
a
this
very
would
old
be
road.
this would be a typical traffic at the
But
time.
it shows you the
Yeah.
rural nature of the environment at that time.
right. When it was Breakheart Hill Farm, did they raise primarily crops or cattle or horses or a little bit of everything?
They raised vegetables such as cabbages, corn,
Okay.
hay for the
Hay,
animals.
A lot of hay.
On the farm were 4 horses. We know this is from what Susie told newspapers. About 3 pigs and
Chickens.
and then about 35 chickens,
Oh, okay.
which was primarily her job to take care of.
Right, right.
Yeah, George actually, one of his duties that he gave himself, and he obviously enjoyed doing, was collecting eggs and milk in the morning, and taking the eggs and milk to another farm, to a man who would then sell them for him. So he traveled every day
Right, okay.
to another farm to deliver his milk and eggs.
Yeah.
Right.
So he was actually known throughout that route. It was a long route, and in the town of Saugus, you know, as the man who delivered the eggs and milks
Oh,
and milk
okay.
to a farm.
Oh, so that's another thing. A lot of people would have been familiar with him. It
And he
wasn't
would stop
just a
at,
new
and he
name.
would stop, of course, at a tavern on his way back to the farm, because
Okay.
in those days that's where men
Right.
socialized. There were many taverns,
Yeah.
and the drinking was quite ubiquitous. And they, of course, they made their own cider, which was not non-alcoholic.
right.
It was alcoholic, and that was what they had with every meal. So, and rum was also a very, it was a favorite, and whiskey were favorite liquors for the men.
Okay.
And sometimes Susie would ride with George on the wagon, the old buckboard,
Oh,
and go into town, you know, for supplies. So she wasn't just stuck at the farm continuously.
yeah. If
Questions?
you have, after this, another project coming up, or do you think you are exhausted from having written this?
And I would say that I did find it exhausting. And I do need breaks between books. So, and it's funny how the books come about, because they really, we haven't really consciously gone out and searched for our subjects. They just kind
find
of
you.
come to us. So I
Right.
kind of wait for inspiration, and I actually don't expect other people to suggest topics for me. I think it just comes from just our reading, you know, just our daily experience, that a story comes your way. That's how it's happened with all 5 of the books.
Yeah, just
to
like
date.
this was a little sideline of one of your other books.
Right. So at the first book we wrote, I said I'd never do another, and then the second book I said I think that's the last, and then the third. So now I don't say, I don't say it's the last, but I don't know. And I do enjoy the true crime genre, and so that I think might be the course of another book, rather than going back to the more general books that we've done in the past, which I enjoyed also, but this new genre presents a whole new set of challenges.
So we think there are other stories out there, but we also think that organizations like yours, the Historical Society, is a wonderful resource for people to learn about how rich Saugus history is.
Of course.
Well, I think it's exciting that there's always something new, even in a small town, to find out, and it gives some insight into why the town is like it is. Maybe the murder doesn't explain the town so much, but some of the old businesses and locations, and gives us some idea, some background that only insiders in the town really know. Because so many people think of Saugus as just Route 1. They can name a restaurant they've been to, and many of them don't even know that there's a little town, or that there's a lot of woods just a few steps away from Route 1.
Or that there was it was the center of attention of a huge event, and dominated, the press for months.
Right.
That gets forgotten very quickly. It's amazing how something really big, and I think we know that from our own lives, that something big happens, and we think this is changing everything, and this is so monumental that people will remember, and they don't.
Well,
Time passes and stories get forgotten, no matter how much attention they got at the time. And I think that to me is a big lesson of this. Also, is discovering stories that I don't think I would have heard about if I hadn't made the effort to do a little digging.
Right. This has really been a fascinating discussion. I'm so glad that I got to talk to you about this latest book of yours. I've been intrigued by every single one of them, but this is a little step outside the box in a sense. Thank you so much for talking about it. I look forward to looking through that book again, and also to maybe hearing your next project when you come up with one.
Well, thank you very much, Laura, for your wonderful questions, and thanks also to WCAT for their wonderful studio facilities to make this all possible.
Yes.
It was really a pleasure.